With assassination being front and centre in the news last week, it got me thinking about some of the stranger forms of assassination which have been tried over the years. Nowadays, more often than not, the choice of weapon for a would-be assassin is a rifle or a handgun. But sometimes more exotic methods have been tried, and they've succeeded. So here are 3 infamous assassinations that did not involve firearms. Number 1. Leon Trotsky. In the 1977 song No More Heroes by the British punk rock band The Stranglers, there's a lyric which as a kid never made much sense to me. It goes, "Whatever happened to Leon Trotsky? He got a nice pick, which made his ears burn." Now, only as an adult and learning more about the Russian Revolution did that song lyric make more sense, as Trotsky certainly did get a nice pick, and it did a lot more than make his ears burn, that's for sure. So, Leon Trotsky was one of the founding architects of the 1917 Russian Revolution. He was a very prominent figure. He was one of the big 3, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky. Following Lenin's death in 1924, many thought that Trotsky would be the successor, but it was not to be. In the ensuing power struggle, it was Stalin who was victorious, and in the months following Stalin's rise to power, it became clear that the two men had widely differing views about communism and the future of the Soviet Union. Trotsky, ever the idealist, advocated for a kind of rolling, continuous, worldwide workers' revolt, where Soviet Russia would instigate and support revolutions across the globe, leading, in his mind at any rate, to a worldwide utopia of communist states. Stalin, much more pragmatic and having now had a taste of unbridled power, had other ideas. He was happy and content to have complete and unopposed control over the USSR. The rest of the world could carry out their own revolutions in their own sweet time. He was the new supreme leader, and anyone who had ideas to the contrary would soon find out that it was not a good idea to cross him. Even old and revered comrades, such as Leon Trotsky, were not immune from Stalin's paranoia and ruthlessness. Due to his outspoken criticism of Stalin's authoritarian style of leadership, Trotsky had put a bullseye on his own back. First, Stalin had him removed from the Politburo, then exiled to Kazakhstan, before finally booting him out of the USSR altogether in 1929. Banished and stateless, the exiled Trotsky sought refuge where he could, finally receiving asylum from Mexico in 1936. Although far away and by now relatively harmless, Trotsky continued to be in Stalin's thoughts, and it seems that he couldn't rest until he had eliminated his old comrade. First, he tried with brute force, and he sent a group of 20 armed militia who stormed Trotsky's residence in Mexico City and raked the house with machine gun fire. But by luck or fate, Trotsky was unharmed, so Stalin next resorted to a more devious approach. On August 20th, 1940, a regular visitor to the Trotsky residence, a man named Frank Jackson, arrived in the afternoon bringing with him a manuscript which he wanted Trotsky to review before it was published. Sensing nothing out of the ordinary, Trotsky invited Jackson in and the two men went to his study to discuss the paper. However, as Trotsky was leaning over his desk to read it, Jackson whipped out a sharpened ice pick from under his jacket and without hesitation struck hard at the back of Trotsky's head, burying the steel point 2 inches deep into Trotsky's skull. Incredibly, Trotsky survived the initial attack, even managed to fight back before his guards rushed in and overpowered Jackson. Trotsky was immediately rushed to hospital where he underwent emergency surgery. Although initially seeming to recover, Trotsky later fell into a coma and died the next day from his injuries. It seemed that the long and deadly reach of Stalin had finally found its man. Frank Jackson was apprehended at the scene and arrested. He insisted that he had acted alone and that he had no ties to Stalin or to the Soviet regime. He was sentenced to 20 years in a Mexican prison for the killing. However, in 1952, some 12 years into his sentence, Frank Jackson was revealed to actually be a man named Ramon Mercader, a Spanish communist recruited by the Soviet NKVD during the Spanish Civil War. Upon his release, Mercader flew to Cuba and then on to Moscow, where the long-incarcerated KGB agent was received as a hero by the Soviet elite, who awarded him the Order of Lenin and the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. He lived out his remaining years in comfort, jetting between Moscow and Havana before dying of natural causes in 1978. Number 2. Georgy Markov. Georgy Markov was a Bulgarian writer and dissident who, during the period of the Cold War, defected to the West, taking up residence in London and working for the BBC and Radio Free Europe. Born in 1929, Markov grew up in a nation which, after the Second World War, had become a kind of vassal state for the USSR. Bulgaria, or to use its official title at the time, the People's Republic of Bulgaria, was ruled by Todor Zhivkov as head of the Bulgarian Communist Party. Despite censorship and Soviet-style guidelines about what one could and could not write about, Markov's career as a writer and journalist initially flourished, and he was one of several influential intellectuals who were actually on close personal terms with the de facto leader Zhivkov. However, as Markov's work grew increasingly satirical and more overtly critical of the Zhivkov regime, he soon found himself walking a very fine line between being a successful, well-known writer and becoming an enemy of the state. In 1969, Markov left Bulgaria to visit his brother in Italy. Markov hoped that some time away from Zhivkov might cool things down, but when the Bulgarian authorities declined to renew his passport and demanded that he immediately return to Bulgaria, he saw the writing on the wall and decided to defect to the West. Markov moved to London, ending up working for the BBC and Radio Free Europe, where, free from restraint, he became a very open and very vocal critic of Zhivkov and the Communist Party elite. Back in Bulgaria, Markov was tried in absentia and was charged with defection. He was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison and he was labelled a traitor. His books and plays disappeared from the bookstores and his name was scrubbed from public life. Nonetheless, he continued broadcasting scathing criticisms from London, and as we all know, the one thing that these authoritarian autocrats hate is open and vocal criticism of their regime. Markov may not have known it, but his days were numbered. On a day seemingly like any other, Markov was waiting on Waterloo Bridge to catch a bus to work, when he felt a sharp sting or prick on the back of his thigh. As he turned around to see what had caused the pain, he saw a man fumbling with an umbrella just behind him. The umbrella man apologised and then walked off. He flagged down a passing cab and drove off, never to be seen again. Markov caught the bus and went to work, but the pain in his leg continued to intensify, and by the evening he felt so ill that he wasn't able to broadcast his show, and he had to go home. By the next day, Markov was vomiting and running a high fever. Although admitted to hospital, his condition continued to worsen. The following day he was shivering uncontrollably, vomiting up blood, and was unable to speak. By the day after, he was dead. His body was under so much strain that his heart finally just gave out and he died of a massive heart attack. He was just 49 years old and he left behind a wife and daughter. Doctors initially put the cause of death down to blood poisoning, but as Markov had earlier mentioned the possibility of being poisoned, a large tissue sample from the back of his thigh was removed and sent to the chemical labs at Porton Down for analysis. Not really sure what they were looking for, the scientists at Porton Down were lucky to notice a tiny metal bead embedded in one side of the tissue sample. This tiny bead, which was less than 2 mm in diameter, was inspected under a microscope where it was found to have 2 drilled cavities. The conclusion was that this tiny pellet had been filled with poison and probably sealed with a wax that would melt at body temperature, and this pellet had been injected into Markov's leg by the man with the umbrella. The umbrella was actually the murder weapon, most likely fitted with a kind of a needle tip, possibly allowing the pellet to be fired by compressed air. To this day, no one is entirely sure of what poison was used. Ricin is the most widely accepted one, although some have questioned whether the tiny pellet could have actually held enough ricin to kill an adult male. But whatever was in that pellet, just a minuscule amount of it was enough to kill Georgy Markov in a matter of a couple of days. The case of the umbrella assassin and the death of Markov passed into a kind of spycraft urban legend. It was such an audacious killing, it's just something like straight out of a James Bond movie. And to this day, no one has ever owned up to Markov's killing, although many suspect that the KGB provided the weapon and the Bulgarian secret police were the ones who carried out the killing. As far as we know, the assassin got away scot-free, and the murder of Georgy Markov remains unsolved to this day. Number 3. Inijiro Asanuma. Well, this is one case of assassination where the identity of the killer is in no doubt, as it happened right in front of a packed hall of witnesses and was caught on camera live on TV. In Japan, the period following the defeat in the Second World War must have been a time of great chaos and confusion. The war had ended with the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Japanese emperor, who was seen as a living god, had been forced to surrender to a foreign power. As Japan began to rebuild itself during the 1950s, there were many different political forces at play, and so it's no wonder that you had Japanese political groups who had gone to the far left, as well as those who had gone to the far right. To say that there was massive polarisation on the political extremes is putting it mildly. Inijiro Asanuma was the post-war leader of the Japanese Socialist Party. He was seen by those on the left as a leader who could relate to the average working man. He lived in public housing and he had modest tastes. However, he made what many on the left saw as a major political blunder when in 1959 he made a trip to communist China. There, he gave a speech in front of Chairman Mao, declaring that the United States was the shared enemy of China and Japan. As he returned from his trip and disembarked from the plane, he was seen wearing a Mao-style Chinese suit. Now, even some of his own party members thought that this was a step too far. After all, Japan had been at war with China as well as with the States during World War II. So, if Asanuma's pro-Mao, pro-China stance infuriated some of his own party members, well, you can just imagine what those on the extreme right thought about it. One young man who viewed Asanuma as a threat to Japan which could not be ignored was a 17-year-old named Otoya Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi had been part of the Greater Japan Patriotic Party, a right-wing movement which fully supported the involvement of the US in rebuilding Japan and firmly rejected the spread and influence of the communists. There had been many brawls and violent incidents over the past year during what were known as the Anpo protests, where the left marched in their thousands and the right staged counter-demonstrations. Believing that Japan was on the verge of a full-scale communist revolution akin to what had happened in China, Yamaguchi decided that the time had come for direct action. He decided that he was going to assassinate Asanuma. On October the 12th, 1960, Asanuma was going to be participating in a televised election debate at Hibiya Hall in central Tokyo, alongside the leaders of the other main parties. Now, he took to the stage at 3 in the afternoon, and just 5 minutes later, as Asanuma was getting into the stride of his speech, Yamaguchi rushed onto the stage. Dressed in his school uniform, Yamaguchi barreled straight towards Asanuma, drawing out a short but very sharp samurai sword from beneath his jacket. Thrusting the sword forwards, he slammed into the big man at the podium, striking Asanuma in the left side. He drew to strike again, but was swarmed by onlookers and wrestled to the ground. This award-winning press photograph captured the moment that Yamaguchi was poised to strike for his second blow. Asanuma, still standing, seems frozen in shock. He staggered around for a bit on stage afterwards, before being helped off into the wings to receive aid. It was no use. Just 20 minutes later, Asanuma succumbed to the stab wound. The sword had penetrated all the way into his stomach, and there was nothing that anyone could do. The assassin, Yamaguchi, was unrepentant. He insisted that his actions were necessary for the stability of Japan, and that he had acted alone. No group had planned this action. He, and he alone, would shoulder the blame. Just a couple of weeks later, while imprisoned awaiting trial, Yamaguchi knotted the sheet in his cell, and he ended it all. His last message written on the cell wall read, "Long live the Emperor, would that I have 7 lives to give for my country." Yamaguchi's actions, far from being condemned, were lauded by the right, and he was hailed as a martyr. He was given a ceremonial burial on 15th of December 1960, and just a few weeks after Yamaguchi's death, a nationwide coalition of right-wing groups held a national memorial service for our martyred brother Yamaguchi Otoya. Ironically, the service was held in Hibiya Public Hall, where the assassination of Asanuma had taken place. So there you have it, 3 assassinations where the killer got up close and personal. There's one more story over on my Patreon, but be warned, Patreons, reading about that one could bring tears to your eyes. As always, thanks for watching. See you in the next video.